At 09:17, June 4, 1942, the Pacific is empty in every direction. Just broken cloud layers and hard sunlight over open water, northwest of Midway Atoll. A formation of U.S. Navy aircraft is pushing west at low altitude, trying to stay under the horizon of enemy lookouts. In the lead fighter section is Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thach, 37 years old, commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3, VF3. He is in a Grumman F4F Wildcat from USS Yorktown, CV-5, escorting 12 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. The Devastators are slow, barely over 100 knots on the approach. They carry one torpedo each, and they have almost no defensive firepower that matters against a modern fighter. Thach knows that if the enemy has carriers out there, they also have fighters, fast ones, waiting above. At 09:19, Thach scans higher. He forces his eyes to the bright part of the sky, the place pilots hate to look. He is searching the sunline. He finds them. Tiny specks, not below, not level, above where the glare hides motion until it's too late. They are coming down from altitude with the sun behind them, exactly the attack American instructors warned about, and exactly the kind of attack Japanese naval aviators have practiced since China. The first dive is clean and deliberate. The specks swell into aircraft with long wings and tight cowlings. The silhouettes are unmistakable now. Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. They are higher, faster, and already positioned to choose the fight. This is what U.S. pilots had been warned about months earlier in reports and briefings passed around ready rooms and intelligence desks. The warnings were real, but they were uneven, diluted by distance and disbelief. Before the war, a lot of American aviators assumed Japan couldn't build a first-rate carrier fighter. That assumption dies in the first seconds of the dive. At 09:19, the Zero pilots strike the slowest target, the TBDs. It is basic air combat math. The TBDs can't run, they can't climb, they can't turn sharply at torpedo approach speed without losing formation and losing the attack. If the Zeros cut them down early, the carriers survive. Thach is flying an F4F, a machine built around survival. It's stubby and heavy, with armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, features that can keep a pilot alive after taking hits. But the Wildcat pays for that protection. It doesn't climb like the enemy. It doesn't turn like the enemy. In a pure low-speed circle fight, the Zero can outrate it, outradius it, and slide onto the Wildcat's tail as if pulled by a wire. The Wildcat's strengths are different. It can take punishment. It can dive fast without coming apart. Its controls stay relatively firm at high speed, and it carries heavy guns. 50 caliber machine guns with enough mass behind the bullets to tear through aluminum and ignite fuel. But those guns are not magic. In 1942, a Wildcat pilot gets only seconds of firing time before the ammunition runs thin. Every burst has to count. At 09:20, tracers appear around the first Devastator. The fire isn't random, it's disciplined, aimed at engines and cockpits, with the Zeros using short, controlled bursts. The Japanese pilots are trained to attack from above, then climb back up to altitude. They don't stay down low unless they want to. This is energy fighting, but with a twist. They also have the option of turning inside anything the Americans are flying. Thach watches a Zero flash past his canopy, close enough that he can see the pale paint and the red disc on the wing. The Zero doesn't linger. It slashes through, then lifts back up, using the altitude it already owns. Thach's problem is immediate and mechanical. The Devastators are slow. If his Wildcats stay high, they lose sight of attacks coming under the sun. If they drop low to guard the TBDs, they risk being bounced, again and again, by fighters that can climb back above and reset the engagement. At 09:21, he makes a decision that looks small from a distance, but changes everything at close range. He tightens his formation and forces his wingmen to stay paired. This is not how many U.S. pilots started the war. Early on, pilots tended to break into individual turning fights, one man chasing one opponent, because it felt natural, because it looked heroic, and because pre-war training still carried traces of a dueling mentality. Against the Zero, that approach is a trap. The Zero's maneuverability pulls Americans into low-speed spirals where the Zero's tighter turning circle becomes a weapon. Thach has been thinking about this problem for months. He has studied what little intelligence the Navy has. He has listened to combat reports. He has talked to other pilots and run mental drills. And he has built a defensive answer that doesn't require the Wildcat to outturn the Zero. The method is simple enough to explain on a chalkboard and brutal enough to save lives in the air. Two fighters fly as a team, and when an enemy fighter commits to the tail of one, the pair turns towards each other in a coordinated weave. The enemy can follow one for briefly, but doing so pulls him into the guns of the other. It isn't a trick, it's geometry and discipline. At 09:22, Thach keys his radio. He keeps his voice flat, like an instructor on a range. Hold tight, stay paired, don't chase. Below him, the Devastators continue forward, still committed to the torpedo run they were ordered to make. They can't outrun fate, they can only push into it. At 09:23, the Zeros come again, another wave from above, another attack line hidden in glare. They are now fully committed, and they are starting to separate the American formation, trying to peel fighters away from the bombers. One Zero drops on the tail of a Wildcat in Thach's section. The Wildcat begins to turn, instinctively, trying to shake the attacker. Thach sees the moment where old habits would kill the pilot. A tightening circle, a loss of airspeed, the Zero sitting comfortably outside the turn, nose steady, guns aligned. Thach moves his Wildcat into position. He watches the spacing. He measures closure by sight and instinct. There is no time for more instructions. At 09:24, he commits the pair to the maneuver. The weave begins. Two American fighters turning towards each other as the Japanese fighter stays locked behind one of them, confident, aggressive, and, if Thach is right, about to fly straight into a crossing field of .50 caliber fire.
The Wildcat on the outside of the pair turns in hard, holding just enough airspeed to keep the controls responsive. The second Wildcat turns toward him, nose slicing across the same patch of sky. The Zero stays locked on the first American fighter, confident in the turn fight it has won a dozen times already. At 09:24:30, the geometry closes. The Zero's pilot is focused on one tail, one target, one kill. He does not want to break off. Breaking off wastes altitude and loses initiative. But as the Zeros learned in 1942, initiative can become fixation. At 09:25, the crossing angles line up. The second Wildcat's gun sight swings through the Zero's path. The pilot does not spray. He waits until the wings fill the ring. He fires. 6.50 caliber machine guns chatter in a short burst. Tracers streak out and disappear into the glare. At this speed, the range is measured in fractions of a second. The bullets hit with no visible drama at first, small flashes, a sudden twitch of the aircraft, and then the Zero breaks, rolling away and diving. Whether it is destroyed or simply driven off is less important in that moment than the lesson. A committed Zero can be punished if the Americans fight as a pair. At 09:26, more Zeros drop in, now aware that the Wildcats are not scattering into solo turns. The Japanese pilots adjust. They begin to attack from higher angles, using slashing passes and staying clear of the crossing arcs where the paired Wildcats can concentrate fire. It is still not an even fight. The Zero is a purpose-built carrier fighter designed around range and maneuverability. Powered by a Nakajima Sakai radial engine and built light, almost aggressively light, it climbs quickly, turns tightly, and holds energy well at medium speed. Its armament is heavy for the time, typically two 20mm cannon in the wings and two rifle-caliber machine guns in the nose. Against unarmored aircraft, a few cannon hits can tear a wing or detonate a fuel tank. And early in the war, many U.S. pilots learned the hard way that the Zero could take a high-angle shot, convert altitude into speed, fire, and climb back up before the Americans could respond. The ARCAT's design philosophy is the opposite. It carries armor. It carries self-sealing tanks. It carries a rugged airframe and landing gear built for carrier landings that can break lesser aircraft. It dives well. It can absorb punishment that would kill a lighter fighter. But it does not have the Zero's turn performance, and it does not like low-speed fights. At 09:27, Thach watches another Devastator take hits. The TBD's rear gunner fires back with a single flexible machine gun. The rounds do not deter the attacking fighters. The torpedo plane staggers, loses altitude, and slips out of formation. The torpedo squadron keeps going. That persistence is not romantic, it is procedural. The TBD crews were trained to press an attack until it was physically impossible. They know their aircraft is obsolete. They know they are slow. They know their torpedoes are unreliable. None of that changes the order. At 09:28, the escort problem becomes brutal. If the Wildcats chase Zeros, they leave the bombers exposed. If they stay glued to the Devastators, they are forced into predictable paths where the Zeros can plan their dives. Thach holds his section close and keeps repeating the same rule in his head: do not turn with them. At 09:29, a Zero drops onto another Wildcat, coming from above and behind, sun at its back. The American pilot begins to bank into a defensive turn. Thach forces the weave again, calling his wingman in. The pair turns toward each other, drawing the attacker across a line of fire. This time, the Zero breaks earlier. The Japanese pilot has seen the trap. He rolls out and climbs, giving up the shot rather than passing through the crossing guns. That is the first measurable change in the engagement. The Zeros are still dominant in performance, but the Americans are imposing a cost. They are forcing the Japanese to choose, commit and risk being hit, or disengage and lose the immediate kill. At 09:31, the sky below is chaos. Individual aircraft scattering, some burning, some losing altitude in shallow spirals. The Devastators, in ones and twos now, continue toward the carrier formation. Thach knows what this means even before anyone says it aloud. A torpedo attack without mass is a near-suicide run. Torpedo planes are supposed to force a carrier to turn, to present its broadside to other attackers, to pin it in place for dive bombers coming from above. That requires timing, coordination, and numbers. At 09:32, the formation is being destroyed piece by piece. This is the hard reality of the early Pacific Air War. In the first months, over the Philippines, over Wake, over the Dutch East Indies, American air units discovered that bravery did not compensate for bad matchups. The wrong aircraft, the wrong tactics, and the wrong assumptions could erase a squadron in minutes. In 1941 and early 1942, U.S. fighters and pilots were often thrown into fights with incomplete intelligence and inadequate doctrine. Many still believed the best defense was a tighter turn and a harder pull. Against the Zero, that belief got people killed. At 09:34, Thach catches sight of another Zero climbing back up through the sun line. They are regaining altitude, preparing to repeat the attack. The fight is cycling, dive, fire, climb, reset. The Zeros are using height like a bank account, spending it to buy speed and position, then earning it back. Thach tries to break that cycle where he can. He pushes his Wildcat into a shallow dive to build speed, then climbs just enough to threaten the Zero's return path. He is not chasing a turn, he is contesting the vertical. At 09:36, he sees a Zero hesitate just a second before committing to another pass. That hesitation matters. In air combat, hesitation is time. Time is separation. Separation is survival. But survival is not victory. At 09:38, the torpedo squadron is nearly gone. The surviving Devastators press on at wave-top height, still trying to line up for a torpedo drop.
The Zeros keep hammering them, and shipboard anti-aircraft fire begins to reach up as they approach the carrier formation. Thach holds his section together and keeps weaving, forcing Zeros to break off and re-attack. He can't save the torpedo planes through heroics. He can only do it through method, through discipline, geometry, and the refusal to play the Zeros game. At 0940, the Americans are no longer surprised by the attack from the sun. They are still outclassed in the turn, still under pressure, still bleeding aircraft. But they are adapting in real time. And in 1942, adaptation is what keeps the Pacific from becoming a closed book written in Japanese victories.
At 9:41, Thach's fuel gauges are already a quiet problem. The Wildcat's range is not infinite, and the combat air patrol problem is always the same. Every hard turn burns fuel. Every climb burns fuel. Every minute spent escorting slow bombers pulls fighters farther from the carrier they must eventually protect. A fighter pilot can win a dogfight and still lose the mission if he can't make it back to deck. Below, the last devastators stagger toward the Japanese carriers at sea level. They are now separated, exposed, and targeted from multiple directions. At 9:42, a Zero drops low and fires into a torpedo plane from the rear quarter. The devastator's wing shudders. It starts a shallow descent, then a steeper one. The crew doesn't bail out. There isn't time. Even if they escape the aircraft, the ocean is an enemy on its own, cold, empty, and full of distance. Thach keeps his section tight. He forces his wingman to stay close enough that the weave remains possible. He watches the sunline again, and again. This is the tactical reality American pilots are learning the hard way in 1941-42. The Zero is not dangerous because it is invincible. It is dangerous because it controls the terms of engagement. It chooses when to dive. It chooses when to climb away. And at low speed, it turns inside American fighters like they are tied to a post. The warning was not that the Zero could outturn. That was already suspected. The warning was what that capability meant in combat. If an American pilot panics and pulls into a turning duel, the Zero will take his tail. If the American tries to climb with it, the Zero will still be above him and will still have the sun. By 9:44, Thach sees the fight splitting into two separate battles. One is close, low, and brutal, Zero slaughtering torpedo bombers. The other is high, fast, and uncertain, Wildcats trying to stop the Zeros from cycling attacks without being dragged into a turn fight. At 9:45, he does what the Wildcat can do better than the Zero. He takes speed and uses it as armor. He noses down into a controlled dive to build kinetic energy, then pulls up only enough to threaten the path of a climbing Zero. It is not a chase, it is a denial. The Wildcat doesn't need to sit on a Zero's tail. It needs to force the Zero to break, to waste time, to lose the clean attack geometry that makes it lethal. At 9:47, a Zero dives again, but not with the same confidence. It angles away sooner. It doesn't linger in the low-speed spiral. It doesn't want to become a target in a crossing weave. Thach doesn't celebrate. He files it away. This is how doctrine is born. Not in a memo, but in the moment pilots realize what works and what gets them killed. At 9:50, the torpedo attack is essentially finished. The surviving devastators, if any are still flying, are scattered and low on fuel and damage-tolerant structure. The Japanese carriers are still afloat. Their flight decks are still operating. Thach's Wildcats, battered and busy, are now in the worst possible position. Low, dispersed, and with limited altitude to see what comes next. But what comes next is not another Zero attack. At 10:20, the battle changes in a way that none of the men in the torpedo planes will live to understand. U.S. Navy SBD Dauntless dive bombers, arriving from altitude, find the Japanese carriers at the moment their defenses are least prepared to deal with them. The Japanese combat air patrol has been dragged down by the torpedo attacks. Fighters are low, guns are pointed outward and downward. Deck crews are in the middle of frantic rearming and refueling cycles. In carrier warfare, timing is everything, and that timing is paid for with the bodies of the torpedo squadrons. In minutes, the American dive bombers turn the balance of the war. Thach is not watching the carrier decks burn from a safe distance. He is still fighting in an aircraft built for yesterday's assumptions, still enforcing discipline in the air while the strategic picture flips beneath him. But later, when the battle is studied in classrooms and ready rooms, the same conclusion repeats. The early Pacific War was a test of adaptation. The Zeros' initial dominance forced the U.S. Navy to do something it had not fully done in peacetime, discard the romantic idea of the individual duel and replace it with team tactics, energy management, and standardized defensive maneuvers. The Thach Weave is not mystical. It is simply a way to deny the Zero its favorite solution. It depends on two things American training could produce quickly: communication and discipline. Two Wildcats flown in mutual support can create overlapping fields of fire. The Zero can still outturn them, but it can no longer do so safely while fixated on a single target. By June 1942, that idea spreads faster than any new aircraft can be delivered. Pilots who survive early encounters carry the lessons to the next squadron. In briefings, in chalk talks, in hurried conversations on carrier decks, the rules harden. Don't turn with a Zero at low speed. Keep altitude when possible. Use high-speed diving passes. Fight in pairs. Force the enemy into your wingman's guns. And the Navy does not rely on tactics alone. By late 1942 and into 1943, the material side begins to catch up. New fighters arrive with the performance to match doctrine. The Grumman F6F Hellcat, heavier than a Wildcat but with a powerful engine and better climb, and the Vought F4U Corsair, fast and lethal in the dive. The U.S. also improves pilot training pipelines, gunnery instruction, and fleet coordination. Radar and fighter direction begin to mature, making surprise from the sun harder to execute cleanly against alert carriers. Thach's role changes as the war changes. A commander who can translate combat lessons into a simple, teachable system becomes valuable beyond his own cockpit. He is no longer just a pilot trying to survive the next pass. He becomes part of a broader shift, turning the chaotic lessons of 1941-42 into procedures that can be taught to men who have never seen combat. At 18:30 that evening, when surviving aircraft return to their carriers, the battle is not measured only in kills. It is measured in what the living pilots can explain to the next wave, why the Zero was so dangerous, and how to stop dying like it was 1941. The next fight will not be easier. The next fight will still include the sun, the altitude advantage, and the sudden dive from above. But it will also include a new American reflex. Don't fight alone. Don't fight flat. Don't fight the enemy's fight.
The sea is calm, but the carrier decks are not. At 1837, a Wildcat drops its landing gear and fights the burble behind the ship. The pilot is tired, half-deaf from engine noise, and still keyed to the sound of cannon shells that aren't there anymore. The landing signal officer gives the paddles. The fighter hits the deck hard, tailhook scraping, then catches a wire and stops in less than 100 feet. Crewmen run in, chalking wheels, pulling the plane forward, counting bullet holes with quick eyes and no comment. Thach steps down from his cockpit at 1849 and walks straight into the debrief space. The smell of burned cordite is still on his clothes. He doesn't talk about fear. He talks about angles. He sketches the weave on a board. Two fighters, crossing turns, an attacker pulled through a gun solution. He keeps it simple because it has to be teachable. In 1942, nothing survives long if it depends on genius or luck. It has to work for average men on their worst day. At 21:10, the ship is darkened for night operations. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese survivors are doing the same math from the other side. How many pilots they lost, how many they can replace, how many decks are still usable. By June 5th, the tactical lesson is already spreading.
Pilots repeated in ready rooms and on the flight deck over coffee and cigarette smoke. Don't turn with a zero. Fight in pairs. Make him choose. 2 days later, on June 7, 1942, the price of the battle is finalized when USS Yorktown, damaged and under tow, goes down after further attack. Some of the men who flew off her will never see her again. What they carry forward isn't a ship, it's a method. Thach does not stay frozen in the moment of Midway. The Navy can't afford that. In mid-1942, the U.S. is building squadrons as fast as it can train pilots to fill them, and training is now as decisive as any single battle. The service begins pulling experienced combat aviators out of the cockpit and into instruction roles, an ugly trade in the short term, a strategic advantage in the long term. At 8 hours on a training morning weeks later, a brand new pilot climbs into an F4F with fresh paint and 0 combat hours. Thach stands on the line and watches him taxi. The instructor's job is not to make the student brave. The student is already brave. The job is to make him disciplined. He tells them what the Zero does. It climbs above you. It comes out of the sun. It wants you to panic and turn. Then he tells them what to do instead. Hold speed, use the dive, stay with your wingman. In 1941, before any of this was public knowledge, Thach had already been working the problem in a quiet, almost absurd way, moving matchsticks on a table, testing geometry when he didn't have an enemy aircraft to test against. That small act becomes part of the institutional shift. Tactics are no longer just inherited tradition. They are analyzed, refined, and standardized. By 1943, the material balance is also shifting. Wildcats are giving way to aircraft that can fight the vertical battle without apology. The F6F Hellcat arrives with power and climb. The F4U Corsair arrives with speed and dive performance. These fighters don't erase the need for teamwork. They amplify it. A fast, heavily armed aircraft flown with discipline becomes a weapons system, not a duelist's mount. Thach's career rises with the war's demands. Later in the conflict, he moves into higher-level aviation planning, serving as an air operations officer on the staffs that run the fast carrier war. This is a different kind of cockpit. Maps, radios, sortie counts, refueling cycles, flight deck capacity, and the raw arithmetic of attrition. In late 1944, the Japanese begin using kamikaze attacks at scale. The threat is not dogfighting skill now, it is intent. A pilot who doesn't care if he dies changes the equation. Traditional intercept patterns and anti-aircraft fire struggle against determined aircraft diving in at high speed. Thach responds the same way he did in 1942. He reduces chaos into a system. The fleet needs early warning. It needs fighters farther out, not stacked close to the carriers. It needs radar pickets, destroyers and destroyer escorts placed well ahead of the main force so incoming raids are detected earlier and intercepted sooner. It needs continuous combat air patrol overhead and coordinated fighter direction from the ships. The idea becomes known as a big blue blanket, a constant protective layer of fighters meant to break attacks before they reach the carriers. It is not a perfect defense. It pushes risk outward. The picket ships pay for early warning with their own exposure. But it is a controlled risk, and control is the difference between a fleet that absorbs punishment and a fleet that collapses. At 6:15 on an operational morning during the late war carrier campaigns, the first fighters launch before sunrise. Their job is not to win a glorious fight. Their job is to keep the sky empty over the fleet, hour after hour, section after section, day after day. By September 2, 1945, Thach is present at the formal Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay, no longer the man in a Wildcat staring into the sun, but a senior officer who has spent the war turning brutal experience into repeatable doctrine.
The arc is clear, from six-plane escort fights to fleet-level air defense planning. After the war, the Navy does not stop needing him. He commands major units in the post-war fleet, including carrier commands and development roles as aviation moves into the Cold War. The weapons change: jet aircraft, radar-guided interception, anti-submarine warfare, new carrier wings. But the pattern of his work remains consistent. Diagnose a threat, design a system, train the force to execute it under pressure. In 1958, he takes command of an anti-submarine development group built around a carrier and a network of aircraft and sensors, another problem of detection, coordination, and response. The enemy is now silent submarines, not zeros in the sun, but the requirement is familiar. Find first, position first, strike first. He eventually reaches 4-star rank in senior command. He retires after decades in uniform, carrying a reputation that doesn't rest on a single kill count or a single battle. It rests on something harder to measure and more important to pass on. His legacy is not just a maneuver. It is the idea that air combat is a team discipline, geometry, energy, communication, and training, executed by human beings who are afraid, tired, and outnumbered, and still have to make correct decisions at 300 miles per hour. In museums and naval aviation classrooms, the Zero still appears in the story as the early war shock: light, agile, dangerous. But the deeper lesson is what came after the shock. American pilots learned to stop giving the enemy the fight he wanted. They learned to look into the sunline, and they learned to weave.